Hello and welcome to Supposedly Fun. My name is Greg and I am here today to do a Pulitzer Prize deep dive on a book that I happen to absolutely adore, Interpeter of Maladies, a story collection by Jhumpa Lahiri. Interpeter of Maladies has a special place in my heart when it comes to Pulitzer Prize winners. That's because this is really the book that started me on my way to this very project in which I am reading all of the books that have won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. We'll talk more about that in a moment. This is also one of only 9 story collections to have won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, and Jhumpa Lahiri is one of only 11 authors to win a Pulitzer Prize for fiction for their debut book. It also happens to be one of my favorite books. I included it in my video about the 25 best books of the last 25 years. I will link that down below if you would like to check that out. So I was delighted to reread this book when it came time to do this deep dive. I wanted to time it to the release of Jhumpa Lahiri's new book, which is called Roman Stories. I was off just a little bit because my reading sort of went into a tailspin in the month of September, so I didn't manage to get this done in time for the release of Roman Stories, but I'm a huge fan of just the career of Jhumpa Lahiri in general. Obviously, Interpreter of Maladies was first. It's the one that I read first. There were no other books by her at the time that I read this, but I really could recommend the entire collection of Jhumpa Lahiri fiction. And she has also released a nonfiction book called In Other Words, where she talks about translation. And my cousin is a huge fan of Jhumpa Lahiri as well. My cousin now lives in Rome and really recommended In Other Words to me. That was one of the books that helped her when she was learning the Italian language. She actually read it in English, in Italian. So she's a fan as well because with Roman Stories, which is the new book, let me just hold that one up. My cousin, who lives in Rome now, has said that she lives in the same basic neighborhood where Jhumpa Lahiri does, and she recognizes a lot of the landmarks, and she feels like she can even point out a coffee bar near her that she's pretty sure is featured in one of the stories. So that's pretty cool. But so the other books in order, obviously we start with Interpreter of Maladies, The Namesake. Absolutely a fantastic book. I love it. It was turned into a movie. And then from there, we went to Unaccustomed Earth, which is a collection of short stories and a novella. And then The Lowland, which I read and I don't honestly remember a whole lot about. I have an advanced reader's copy of it. This was longlisted for the Booker Prize. I can't remember if it made the shortlist. Then we get a big departure. In the time between The Lowland and her next book, Jhumpa Lahiri moved to Italy, adopted Italian as a language, and she eventually wrote Whereabouts in Italian and then translated it into English herself. It's very different from the books that came before, but you can definitely sense that it is a Jhumpa Lahiri book, and I absolutely love it. And then you have Roman Stories, which feels like a return to Interpreter of Maladies because it is a story collection, and it sort of deals with the concept of outsiders, which we'll get into a little bit more. I just really adore every single book that Jhumpa Lahiri has published. So I'm really happy to be doing this deep dive. Some notes. There are not really spoilers that I'm going to get into with these stories, so you don't really need to worry about that. I will have timestamps in the description box down below if you would like to navigate to different parts of the conversation. We will talk about how this book jump-started my obsession with the Pulitzer Prize. We'll talk about what the book is about. We'll talk about why I think it won a Pulitzer Prize for fiction. We'll talk about who Jhumpa Lahiri is, the competition for the Pulitzer. All of that stuff is going to be in the description box down below. So you can jump to different parts of the conversation if you'd like, or you can just watch it all the way through. I will also have links to all of my other videos in the Pulitzer series down there. And I will have a link to a video about the Great American Novel because I feel like the Pulitzer Prize is sort of inherently tied to the quest for the Great American Novel, whether or not that even exists. I should also mention that I will have a link to a longer blog post on my website about this, which will have links to all of my sources and information like that. Let's get going and start talking about Interpreter of Maladies. And before, I usually begin with a snapshot, but I want to start talking about how this book led to my obsession with the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, because I think that's a very unique thing to talk about with this book. And then we'll talk about things that happened the year in which it was published. So again, I would say my obsession with the Pulitzer Prize for fiction all started with Interpreter of Maladies. Flashback to 2001. I was newly graduated from high school, and I was working at Borders Books in northern New Jersey instead of going to college. Someone, I do not recall who, recommended Interpreter of Maladies to me. It was one of many very similar conversations I had with adults around this time. You know, adults are always eager to discuss the future with recent high school graduates, or if they weren't interested in discussing what I wanted to do with my life, a question that I found absolutely terrifying at the time because I just didn't know. They latched onto the fact that I worked in a bookstore and told me all of the books that they thought I should get to reading immediately. Most of those recommendations were duly ignored by me. But I did look up some of the books to see if I might be interested in them. Interpreter of Maladies was one of these. And when I plucked a copy from the shelf in the bookstore, I noticed this big silver stamp on the cover proclaiming winner of the Pulitzer Prize. In fact, at that time, Interpreter of Maladies was still the reigning champ because a new winner had not been declared yet in that year. I was familiar with the Pulitzer Prizes at that time, but I had not followed them at all. I read the description on the back of the book, and it sounded interesting, but the silver stamp felt like a solid recommendation for some reason. It announced that this was a book that was worth my time, so I bought a copy of Interpreter of Maladies with my Borders discount as an employee, and I absolutely loved it. Within a few weeks from the time that I purchased this, they announced a new Pulitzer Prize winner, and that was The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which I purchased when it came out in paperback, this time with a golden sticker that advertised winner of the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And I had just as much success with The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay as I did with Interpreter of Maladies. I absolutely loved this book. Not long after that, a friend of my father's recommended A Good Scent from a Strange Mountain to me. It's a story collection. When I got into work, I looked it up, pulled it off the shelf, and saw this banner at the top that says winner of the Pulitzer Prize. And I was delighted to see that. And it immediately said to me, this is a book that I'm probably going to like. I purchased it, I read it, and I did indeed like it a great deal. So you can see how within the span of a year, I learned to equate the Pulitzer Prize for fiction with quality. If I saw it advertised on a book's cover, I felt that I could trust that this would be a good book. And because I was still young and many lessons that burn into your brain at a young age stick with you over time, my association of the Pulitzer Prize with quality books has lasted to this day, even though there have been many instances where I did not agree with their choices. And because I worked in a bookstore, the Pulitzer Prize became something that I paid attention to every year. If a book won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, I knew that people were going to come in and ask for it. So I started watching for the announcement of the Pulitzer Prize every year. And when it was announced, I immediately got on the phone to order copies of the winning book. I did begin to pay attention to the Booker Prize for the same reason around this same time. But Americans in my region, at least, were a lot pickier about that prize. Life of Pi, bestseller. Vernon Got Little, not so much. Meanwhile, the Pulitzer Prize announced Empire Falls and Middlesex as the winners in the 2 years after The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, and those were two books that were really easy to hand sell to customers, mostly because I genuinely loved them, but also because they had that sort of broad appeal. People were really interested in them, and the mark of the Pulitzer Prize meant something to a lot of people who were not just, me. Now, it's likely that as I moved up at the bookstore to take over merchandising for the store, I probably would have discovered the Pulitzer Prize anyway. But all readers look for reliable metrics for book recommendations. And in the days before the internet really took over our lives and before social media transformed the way we get book recommendations, hello from this BookTube channel that you're watching, the Pulitzer Prize stamp was a signal to potential readers. And it definitely was to me as well. The Oprah logo on a book, like that's part of why the Oprah Book Club was so wildly successful in those early years. Having the Oprah logo on a book was a way of telling people this is something that has been endorsed, and if you like the other books in the book club, you will probably like this too. I know there are people who hate on Oprah's book club. I think it was actually a good thing, and it selected a lot of really good books before it changed, and we're not going to get into that right now. I learned to look at the Pulitzer Prize winners as a mark of quality and something that I would be interested in because someone recommended Interpreter of Maladies to me. And the stamp is what made me trust the recommendation. And when I ended up liking the book myself, I looked for more and I was not disappointed. And the Pulitzer Prize has remained a subject of fascination for me in my life. And to the point where today I am doing this project where I'm reading all of the books that have won. And in cases where I have already read the book, I'm rereading them so I can do a sort of video analysis like this very one that you are watching right now. Let's look at 1999 now, because I think it's always fun to look back and see what was going on in the world the year in which a Pulitzer book was published. So Interpreter of Maladies won the Pulitzer Prize for 2000, but the Pulitzer for 2000 was rewarding books that had been published in 1999. That's why we're looking back at that year. So in bookstores, the best-selling books of 1999 are remarkably commercial. John Grisham topped Publishers Weekly's list with The Testaments, followed by Hannibal by Thomas Harris, which is a book that I absolutely despise. Assassins, which was the 6th book in the Christian Left Behind series, was 3rd, and the novelization of Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, was 4th. Michael Crichton's Timeline rounded out the top 5, so you can see that we have come a long way from the very literary or literary fiction-focused bestseller lists of other deep dives. We are looking very commercial in this one. Also that year, Ha Jin won the National Book Award for Fiction for the book Waiting, which is going to come up again later. The Nobel Prize for Literature went to Günter Grass, quote, whose frolicsome black fables portray the forgotten face of history, end quote. And the Booker Prize went to J.M. Coetzee for Disgrace, another book that I really love. At the movies, Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, dominated the box office, earning a good chunk more than the second-place finisher, which was The Sixth Sense. Toy Story 2, Austin Powers' The Spy Who Shagged Me, and The Matrix rounded out the top 5. American Beauty ultimately went on to win Best Picture at the Academy Awards that celebrated 1999 releases. In music, My Little Sister and many other rabid boy band fans propelled the Backstreet Boys to the top of album sales for the year with their new album, Millennium. As an aside, I have to paint a picture for you of what my life was like in 1999 by telling you that the Backstreet Boys album, Millennium, was released right before Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, came out. Like, Millennium was released on Tuesday, and I believe Wednesday was actually the day that The Phantom Menace debuted. So my sister and I got to see The Phantom Menace a day before it actually released in theaters, and I will say no more about that because I don't want to get anyone into trouble. But before we left to get on this road trip to go to where we were going to be able to see the movie a day earlier, we went and picked up my sister's pre-ordered copy of Millennium, and we listened to it on a loop during our drive. So both of my sisters were that big Backstreet Boys fans. I was a big Backstreet Boys fan, but mostly I was a huge Star Wars fan, and The Phantom Menace was ultimately a disappointment. But we don't have to get into that. That's just a quick picture of what was going on in my life in 1999. I was in high school. What can I tell you? In the news, I tried to explain the Y2K hysteria to my foster son a few years ago, and he just did not understand. So I guess you had to be there, but it was a thing. In other news, the impeachment trial of Bill Clinton began in January of 1999. He was acquitted by the Senate in February. In March, Dr. Kevorkian was found guilty of second-degree murder by a Michigan jury in a case that captured a lot of attention, and my foster son probably has no idea who Dr. Kevorkian is now, But if you were alive and paying attention to the media at the time, you absolutely do know who he was and why it was controversial. Another big news story that year came in April when the Columbine high school shooting took place. And unfortunately, school shootings have only become more common since then. Now let's talk about what Interpreter of Maladies is about. The most straightforward way to summarize Interpreter of Maladies is to say that it is a story collection that reflects the experiences of immigrants in the United States, particularly ones of Indian heritage. That is the framework for most discussion that centers on this book, which is fair because that is exactly what it is. And it's mostly done in a very subtle and elegant way. I would say maybe the final story reaches a bit when it draws a thematical link between astronauts landing on the moon and immigrants landing on a new shore. But as the grandson of immigrants who scraped to survive in the United States, I really don't have a problem with it, especially since my grandfather, who immigrated to the US from Italy, passed away as I was finishing this reread this time around. It really got me in the mind space of how difficult it is to uproot your life, go somewhere where you will not be able to communicate well with other people, and try to build a new life from scratch. Really, when you think about it, you might as well be landing on the moon. And that allows me to really appreciate that story, even though it probably is the most heavy-handed story in the collection. I still really like it. It's also about the difficulty of maintaining your traditions in a new land, especially when your children are growing up in a new culture. There's a sense that the place where you came from is slipping away over time. But if you look under the surface, there's actually a lot more going on in this collection as well. In rereading these stories, it struck me how many of them are about failures to communicate. The first story, A Temporary Matter, which is one of my all-time favorite short stories, is about a young couple who no longer know how to connect to each other in the wake of a tragedy. When Mr. Perzada Came to Dine is about a man who joins another family every night to watch the news as he waits to hear from his wife and daughters in Pakistan, not knowing if they are alive or dead. The title story finds a woman telling a driver who also works as a medical interpreter a secret that has been weighing on her and which she does not know how to reveal to her husband. A Real Durwan is about a woman who spins unbelievable yarns about her former life, stories that ultimately get her into trouble because no one believes her anymore. And so on as you work your way through the collection. This is actually a story collection about disconnection. Immigration is a lens it uses to explore that theme. Notice that in these brief summaries I gave for some of these stories, which again are only half of the collection, I don't mention immigration at all. I do also just want to show you a quick little thing about this edition of the book that I have. I love that the table of contents looks like an hourglass, where the shortest story title is in the middle. I just love that little detail. Anyway, I listened to a recent interview Is Jhumpa Lahiri gave about her new story collection, Roman Stories, and she discussed how she frequently stopped naming characters in her recent work. The reason is that names can become a tool to create shorthand for who a character is. People will begin making assumptions and othering her characters, so she doesn't give them the chance anymore. She also talked about how this is something that has happened to her throughout her own life, because her own name identifies her as an outsider in American and Italian society, if someone chooses to see her that way. And this is important because I think the characters in Interpreter of Maladies are facing the same struggles. Each story has at least one character who is separated from the other characters, whether by class, origin of birth, education, etc. And what is an immigrant story if not a story in which an arbitrary designation creates a gulf between two people who are existing in the same place? To classify people as immigrants is to create an other. And that is the genius of Jhumpa Lahiri. Her work has evolved considerably over the years since Interpreter of Maladies was published, yet it all feels connected. It is recognizable as the work of the same person. No matter how much she grows or becomes interested in new things, her work is immediately identifiable and consistent. So why did this book win a Pulitzer Prize? First and foremost, the book is gorgeous. Prize jurors frequently talk about their process, and when they do, they usually ponder whether or not the platform of being on the jury for the Pulitzer Prize should be used to recognize up-and-coming talent. Certainly, in 1999, there was no guarantee that Jhumpa Lahiri would go on to have the incredible career she has enjoyed. But I think this collection is a textbook announcement of a significant new talent, and certainly anointing her with the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for this, her first book, definitely helped her career have that trajectory. Additionally, the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction has a proud tradition of recognizing immigrant stories. There are subtle immigrant stories, like Gone with the Wind, where the story of Scarlett O'Hara's Irish immigrant father is woven into the larger and more problematic story. There are stories about immigrant communities like The Abel McLaughlins, which centers on Scottish immigrants living the pioneer life. There are stories like His Family, where waves of immigrants transforming neighborhoods are initially a source of anxiety, then a cause for charity. Because many people think of America as a country of immigrants, despite the reality that many people were living here when European colonists arrived, it's unsurprising that stories about immigrant life pop up so often in Pulitzer books. But historically, those stories are about white immigrants, usually Irish. Interpeter of Maladies reflects a new type of immigration story because this population had not been seen much in Western literature. I didn't even know what a Salwar Kameez was when I first read this book. And because that was way back in the earlier days of the internet, I couldn't just easily Google it. So I had to find out. And now I know, so I can reread it and know. But at the time, that was something that felt exotic and unknown to me. And I'm glad that it has become more familiar over time with more and more stories like this. So Interpeter of Maladies is a situation where a book scratches an itch in a really cozy way without being just another in a long line of similar books. It breaks new ground while seeming very familiar. Let's talk about Jhumpa Lahiri. Here is a photo of her on the back of the book. She's a stunning woman. My cousin has actually seen her speak in Italy and said she is just as elegant and stunning in person as she is in interviews and in photographs. Not that that means anything. It's just something to note. So Jhumpa Lahiri was born in London in 1967. Her name is actually Nilanjana Sudeshna Lahiri. Her parents had immigrated to London from West Bengal. They moved again when Lahiri was 3 years old to Kingston, Rhode Island. She grew up in America, and as such, she considers herself to be American. It's what she knows. She was too young to really get to know herself as someone who lives in London, so she grew up in America, and here we are. Lahiri's mother was particularly insistent that her children should grow up knowing their Bengali heritage, and this push and pull dynamic between the culture where they lived and the culture they were from obviously had a tremendous impact on Lahiri's career as a novelist. It informs every book that she has written to some extent. Even her current writing set in her new home of Italy reflects this dynamic. And even more significantly, it was Jhumpa Lahiri's kindergarten teacher who began calling her Jhumpa because it was easier to pronounce than her given names. As I mentioned, Lahiri has talked openly about how her name made her feel embarrassed growing up because she felt that it marked her as an outsider. If you're familiar with Lahiri's work, you can probably guess that this is the inspiration behind her first novel, her second book, which was The Namesake. And again, it's why she moved away from naming her characters in her more recent works like Whereabouts and Roman Stories. Jhumpa Lahiri is one of only 11 writers who have won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for their debut. There have only been 2 people who fit that category since she won, Paul Harding and Viet Thanh Nguyen. Lahiri is also the 7th time that a story collection won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, and it remains to this day the last true story collection to have won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. There have been 2 more collections that have won a Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. However, they are both linked story collections, which is much more trendy these days than a pure out-and-out story collection. Those 2 books, by the way, are Olive Kitteridge and A Visit from the Goon Squad. So again, there have been 2 more story collections, but they are linked story collections, not a true story collection like Interpreter of Maladies, which is the last time that it has happened. And it feels like it has become very difficult for a story collection to win a prize like the Pulitzer. As I'm editing this video, I wanted to jump in for a second to just hammer in a point that makes Interpreter of Maladies a very unique book to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, even among story collections. So I mentioned that there have been 9 story collections that have won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. 2 of those are linked stories, and an additional 3 are actually collected stories. I'm specifically referring to the collected stories of Catherine Ann Porter, the collected stories of Jean Stafford, and the stories of John Cheever. Those are books that took previously published story collections and sort of lumped them into one, which makes them feel a little bit more literally like a career achievement award rather than a Pulitzer for new work that had been published. Those will be unique ones to get to, but that means that there have only really been 4 true story collections that have won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, which makes them all the more unique. And those are Tales of the South Pacific by James A. Michener, Elbow Room by James Allen McPherson, A Good Scent from a Strange Mountain by Robert Olin Butler, and Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. Back to the rest. Let's move on to the next category, which is Interpreter of Maladies the Great American Novel? If you've been following along, you know that I believe the Pulitzer Prize is inextricably linked with the quest for the mythic Great American Novel, and you know that I don't think it's possible to encompass everything that you would find in the American experience in just a single book. This is a very sweeping and complicated country. It would be really difficult to do that. The best thing that I think you can do is create a short list of great American fiction, and I do believe Interpreter of Maladies should be on that list. Let's jump to a really interesting question. Who was Jhumpa Lahiri's competition for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction? Now, 1999 was actually, for me, a hugely competitive year for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. There were not a whole lot of other books that I would point out. However, the finalists that were selected are really quite incredible. So obviously you have Interpreter of Maladies, which was the winner. And I absolutely adore Interpreter of Maladies. However, I also adore Waiting by Ha Jin, which, as I said earlier, is the book that won the National Book Award for fiction in 1999. And I especially adore Close Range, Wyoming Stories by Annie Proulx, which was the other Pulitzer Prize finalist, and which was also featured in my list of the 25 best books of the last 25 years. I do think that when you look at these 3 books, you could pretty easily take Waiting out of the equation and narrow it down to Annie Proulx versus Jhumpa Lahiri. And I think winning the National Book Award may have kind of hurt Waiting's chances with the Pulitzer anyway. But this is a really solid list of books that were competing for the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. And now let's ask the really painful question here. Should Interpreter of Maladies have won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction? And this is incredibly difficult. Again, I feel like you could pretty quickly move Waiting out of the equation. As much as I do like the book Waiting, I think you could just really settle down on Annie Proulx or Jhumpa Lahiri for the prize. And why, oh why, did 2 of my favorite books have to be published in the same year? How do I choose between Interpreter of Maladies and Close Range? You know, could this be a year that ends in a tie now that the Pulitzer Board has shown that such a thing is possible? I mean, I would love it because both of these books are absolutely fantastic. Close Range, Wyoming Stories, it has the story that Brokeback Mountain was adapted from. It's so good. You really can't go wrong with either one of these books. And I would love for it to end in a tie, but I feel like I should pick one and not cop out here. I just don't want to choose between the books. I feel like my personal preference might actually lean toward Close Range. After all, when I did that video about the 25 best books of the last 25 years, Close Range was in my top 5, and Interpreter of Maladies was not. However, I actually like the way things worked out with the Pulitzer for both of these authors. Annie Proulx already had a Pulitzer Prize at this point in the year 2000 when they were getting ready to announce the winner for this year. So, you know, she already had one, and I don't think The Namesake, which was Jhumpa Lahiri's next book, would have been as big of a deal if Jhumpa Lahiri had not won the Pulitzer Prize. I feel like the Pulitzer Prize is a huge part of what launched Jhumpa Lahiri's career. So as much as I love Close Range, I also love Interpreter of Maladies. And when it comes down to it, I wouldn't change the way the Pulitzer helped create the trajectory of Jhumpa Lahiri's career. It's a photo finish. If you ask me on another day, I might come up with a different answer. But at this moment, I think the Pulitzer board got it right when they selected Interpreter of Maladies by Jhumpa Lahiri. If you have thoughts about any of these books that I have mentioned, particularly Interpreter of Maladies or any of Jhumpa Lahiri's other books, I'm a huge fan of all of her books again, so I just love talking about them. So let me know what you think of her, any of the books that I've mentioned in the comment section down below. I'd love to know what you think of this book and if you think it should have won. Again, let me know all that. And you can find more links to other Pulitzer Act books and videos down below. It's fun to do videos about books that you love, so I enjoyed doing this. I hope you did as well. And as always, I really appreciate your time. I will be back with another Pulitzer deep dive, hopefully soon. I don't know which book it will be about, but we'll figure it out. So as always, I really appreciate your time, and I will be back. Until next time, happy reading.